I grew up as a missionary kid. When I was 11, my family moved to the opposite side of the world to share the Christian message with the people living there. For 8 years, my life revolved around one mission: saving souls for Christ. It's now been 10 years since I left the mission field and moved back to the US, and a lot has changed. I've changed. I've done a lot of thinking and learning. I no longer see the world as a proverbial house on fire, and I no longer view the souls inside that house as in need of saving. I'm not big on labels, but the one that probably best describes me is agnostic atheist. I don't think it's knowable if a God exists, and the existence of the supernatural is definitionally unverifiable. Therefore, I don't hold a personal belief in a God or the supernatural. This ideological change has left me feeling very alone, though. I don't know many MKs or missionary kids who've deconstructed their Christian faith. In fact, several MKs I grew up with went back into missionary work as adults. Even if you Google what was it like growing up as a missionary kid, the only stories you find are from those who've remained in the church and are still strong supporters of missionary work. I'm all for MKs sharing their stories, no matter what their current religious affiliation is. But it can be isolating to feel like my perspective isn't one that's commonly shared. What's more is that so many of the stories I've come across seem highly manicured. It's almost like MKs tell their stories how they think they're supposed to be told and not how they actually happened. While writing the script for this video, I actually stumbled across a reality TV show about the life of missionary kids. Big shocker here, but the show is sold and streamed by AIG, or Answers in Genesis, which is a fundamentalist Christian organization run by young earth creationist Ken Ham. The stars of this reality TV show are four brothers who, coincidentally, grew up in the same area of the world as I did. Back in 2021, Ken Ham actually interviewed the brothers about what it's like growing up as missionary kids. It seemed like the interview served as a promo for both the MK reality show and AIG's new streaming service, Answers.tv. Side note, I don't suggest watching anything from Answers.tv unless you're just like a glutton for pseudoscience and pseudohistory. Anyway, I found the interview very interesting because the answers they gave to Ken's questions are a perfect example of what I call MK boilerplate.
First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like, well, to be born with missionary parents in a remote part of the world. Tell us what you did there in Papua, Indonesia.
Yeah, so we basically grew up over in the jungle. So we lived about 18 years over in Indonesia, working with this small tribal group out in the middle of the jungle. So think no roads, no hospital, no internet, just this little tribal group out in the middle of the jungle, miles and miles of jungle. And so because they were cut off from all of the civilization, they were also cut off from the gospel. They didn't have any chance to hear about Jesus. They didn't have one scrap of scripture in their own language. So they had no chance to hear about the gospel. So our family went in there. We had to learn the language and the culture. They were an oral culture, so they didn't even have their language written down. So my parents and our coworkers actually created an alphabet for them to translate the Bible into their language so that we could teach them chronologically through the Bible and present to them the gospel. So that's kind of what we did with the people there.
When Ken asked what it was like for them and what they did, notice how the boys didn't answer with what it was like for them personally, but instead emphasized their parents' mission of converting people to Christianity. Their answer seemed almost scripted. So many stories I find on the internet about growing up as an MK sound like this. And why is that? Well, I think the answer is rather straightforward. MKs tell their stories like this because it's what other Christians, especially their parents' financial donors, want to hear. In an evangelical paradigm, your story will never be as important as God's story. This is also why the negative aspects of MK life are rarely talked about. Well, some negative aspects are talked about, but only the ones that don't call into question the religious narratives upheld by most missionary communities. MKs will openly talk about the struggles of navigating multiple cultures or about how it sucks not understanding pop culture references, but those aren't the negative aspects I'm talking about here. What I am talking about is the deep-seated trauma that many of us have experienced. I'm talking about those things that the missionary community would rather be swept under the rug. My goal with this video is to tell my story of growing up as an MK as it actually happened without glossing over the uncomfortable bits. Hopefully, this gives you a more complete picture of what MK life is really like. My family moved to Indonesia to serve as missionaries in 2004. I was 11 and my sister was 9. We weren't your typical missionary family. I think people tend to picture missionaries as these ultra-conservative, prairie skirt-wearing Bible thumpers. My family wasn't that. For the most part, we were just your average American family. We were also specifically involved in mission aviation. My dad was a pilot, and his role was to support the logistical needs of wherever we were sent. Sometimes this meant flying other missionaries in and out of villages or transporting religious materials such as Bibles, but primarily it involved transporting essential goods and services such as food and building materials and performing medical evacuations. My sister and I were much older than what's typical for a family moving to the mission field for the first time. Missionary parents usually enter the field when their children are babies or toddlers. There are a few reasons for this. Most missionaries just happen to decide to go into missions early on in their marriage, and the transition to the mission field is usually much easier for younger children who haven't established strong ties to their home country. For the first year, we lived in Bandung, where my parents attended language school. They were learning Indonesian, and my sister and I attended an international Christian school. For reference, Bandung is a bustling metropolis about 70 miles southeast of Indonesia's capital, Jakarta. I remember our time in Bandung as being pretty rough for me. As a child, I was very sensitive and slow to adapt to change. I still am to a degree. So transitioning from the US to Indonesia, especially to such a busy city, was really difficult. To add insult to injury, I was an early bloomer, like a very early bloomer. At the time, I was taller than most kids my age, including boys, and I was occasionally teased about my height at school. I distinctly remember a small Korean boy from my class calling me a clown because I was tall, had super curly hair, and would blush easily due to hypersensitivity. It's funny how even into adulthood, childhood teasing still really hurts. Honestly, I still view myself that way. I still view myself as this gawky middle schooler that sticks out from the crowd, even though as an adult, I'm of average height and curly hair is like popular now. Puberty is hard for everyone, but I think because I experienced so much transition while also going through a tough puberty, many of those awkward preteen memories are now like burned into my head. Most kids experience childhood teasing, but most kids don't have to deal with their family moving to another country to serve as missionaries at the same time. I think this ends up turning what many consider normal childhood experiences, like being called names at school, into traumatic ones that stick with you into adulthood. The mission community tends to minimize the importance locational stability plays in the psychological well-being of MKs. They may minimize this because they feel like our psychological needs aren't as important as spreading the gospel. The thing is, kids need to feel like they have a safe place to land while they're going through these normal growing pains, and many MKs don't. I know I didn't. Don't get me wrong, I had a very healthy relationship with my family, and I still do, but that doesn't take away from how hard it was to have my exterior environment constantly changing. Even though I no longer move around nearly as much as I did when I was a child, I still feel like the weird new girl in most social situations. It's hard for me to open up to people and be vulnerable because I'm afraid at any moment the rug could be pulled out from under me. That at any moment I could be packing up and moving thousands of miles away. Our time in Bandung was brief, and before I knew it, we were on a plane headed toward the most eastern region of Indonesia, Papua. A thing to know about mission aviation is that it operates somewhat like the military. Families are assigned to a mission base depending on the organization's needs, and you don't have much say as to where you're sent. My family was assigned to Wamena, a remote town only accessible by airplane in the interior of Papua. At first, I did not want to be in Wamena. It made me feel depressed and claustrophobic because of how isolated it was from the rest of the world. The worst part was that I felt guilty for being upset about our move because this was supposedly God's calling for our family. Looking back, though, it makes sense that I felt that way. In the span of a year, my family moved from rural Ohio to one of Indonesia's largest cities, then to one of the most remote locations in the entire world. That's a lot of change for a child. There hasn't been much research done on the psychological well-being of MKs, but the limited research available indicates that many experience what's known as the pedestal effect. Missionaries are often portrayed as saints or perfect godly role models, impervious to grief and stress. They're seen as the ultimate Christians who faithfully follow God's greatest commandment, to go and make disciples of every nation. Many people, including missionaries themselves, assume that because of their religious devotion, missionaries are inherently blessed by God with joy, peace, and mental clarity. People don't think missionaries should experience emotions like sadness or frustration because, after all, they're living perfect, godly lives. This isn't true, though. In fact, some of the most mentally anguished people I've ever come into contact with have been missionaries. MKs who are constantly placed on this pedestal along with their parents tend to suppress those emotions that are inconsistent with the image others have of them. I felt like I shouldn't be upset about our move to Wamena and that I was supposed to be happy because my family was one step closer to furthering God's kingdom. MKs often experience the pedestal effect well into adulthood and even after they've returned to their home country. When I graduated and returned to the US, I subconsciously believed that feeling sadness, anger, or frustration wasn't Christ-like. I thought it showed a failure on my part to trust in God's provision. I would often put up with things that weren't making me happy because I believe that's just what a good Christian does. In the last few years, I've learned that it's not wrong, it's not a sin to simply feel something. Giving yourself the space to sit with your emotions is actually integral to processing and healing from traumatic events. It's something I'm still working on, though. I still sometimes feel guilty when I experience certain emotions, but every day gets a little bit easier. Thankfully, I did eventually adjust to my new home in Wamena, and it actually ended up being one of my favorite places my family ever lived. Being so cut off from the rest of the world, Wamena was a world of its own. The town, which sat quietly at the bottom of the Balim Valley with mountains surrounding every side, it felt like a fortress of sorts. It felt safe. The mission community in Wamena was relatively small and therefore pretty tight-knit. My family lived in a gated-off mission base with other missionaries from our same organization, and every Sunday we would all meet under this pavilion in the middle of the base for church. And there'd be about 20 to 30 of us in attendance, and men from the mission community would take turns preaching. At that time, I was really getting into playing guitar, and I actually still love playing guitar. My sister was learning to play the drums and my dad played the bass. So we three, along with a few others from our community, formed this praise band and we'd play at church. I absolutely loved being part of a band and I still look back at that time in my life very fondly. My sister and I went to this very tiny international school in Wamena, almost exclusively attended by missionary kids. The school was so small that it was actually like a one-room schoolhouse. Kindergarten through 4th grade was in one room, and 5th through 8th grade were in another. There wasn't an international high school in Wamena, so once you completed 8th grade, you got sent to boarding school. The mission community in Wamena was very tight-knit, but I don't remember it being particularly insular. It felt like to a certain extent, individuality and questions were allowed. I felt like I could be myself. Of course, everything we did as a community was broadly framed around Christianity, but there was a lot of diversity in the community itself. Some missionaries were Brethren, which is a denomination of Christianity that's somewhat similar to the Mennonites, but some missionaries were somewhat socially liberal and would probably be considered progressive Christians. No one seemed to be in the business of telling others how to live, or at least no one went around telling their fellow missionaries how they should go about their Christian faith. Of course, being missionaries, everyone's primary goal was to convert the locals to Christianity. So even though I felt like I had room to discover what Christianity meant to me, it was still expected that I stay within the broad Christian faith. When I went into high school, though, that's when things got a little dicey. I dreaded going into high school because that meant I'd be sent to boarding school in Sentani. Sentani, for reference, is a town in northern Papua located just a few miles from the coast and from Papua's capital, Jayapura. In my freshman year, I was lucky enough to avoid boarding school because my family just happened to be on furlough at the time. But when my sophomore year rolled around, I could no longer avoid it. Transitioning from living with my parents in a small missionary community where I felt like I had relative freedom to living in a dorm environment was difficult. Even though Sentani was a larger town, when I moved into the dorm, my entire life became confined to the school grounds. The school also served as the hub for the mission community. All community events, such as church services and social gatherings, took place at the school. So when I say my life became confined to the school grounds, it really was. I had to ask permission for almost everything I did in the dorm. Sometimes this made sense, like asking permission to go off campus and the rare instances that I actually needed to go off campus. But other times it felt unnecessarily restrictive, like asking permission to watch TV or go on the computer. I wasn't used to an environment like that. Plus, being an introvert, I was overwhelmed by constantly being around so many people. I would go home at least once a month to see my parents, but it never felt like enough time to really decompress. Honestly, I felt like an inmate. I managed to last for a year before I just couldn't live in the dorm anymore. Thankfully, my parents ended up moving to the same city the school was in, so I no longer had to live in the dorm, but could keep attending school. My parents have always put the well-being of their children over the mission, which isn't something I can say for some missionaries. I knew missionaries who'd leave their children for months at a time to live in isolated, only recently contacted tribes where they'd try to spread the gospel. My mental health improved when I no longer had to live in the dorm, but there was something that was still bothering me. It felt like my every move was being watched. Something you need to realize about most missionary communities is that parenting is somewhat a group effort. In the missionary world, it's normal and even expected for MKs to refer to the adults of the community as aunt and uncle. I grew up viewing my fellow missionaries as family, even though I wasn't actually related to them. This pseudo-family dynamic can be very beneficial. It allows missionaries to create familial-like bonds despite living thousands of miles away from their real families. I'm still very close to a few people from the mission field and do consider them family. There's a downside to this, though. This dynamic can be used by those who seek control over the lives of others. In the mission community, it was standard to push purity culture on the MKs. A large part of our spiritual discussions, oddly enough, seemed to revolve around sexuality. Dating was somewhat frowned upon, and of course, sex outside of marriage was framed as the greatest sin you could possibly commit. Almost everyone bought into and perpetuated harmful ideas about sex, but certain individuals took a very peculiar interest in what they called protecting our sexual purity. Every semester, we were required to take a Bible class. We were supposed to be studying, the Bible, but our teacher, who was also a missionary and someone I refer to as my uncle, would often use class time to get on his soapbox and talk about sexual purity. He warned us against engaging in any type of sexual behavior, labeling it a sin, and often going into graphic detail about certain sexual acts. I distinctly remember him using a class period to go on a long tirade against anal sex. He went into graphic detail and talked about how dangerous he thought it was. I can't remember exactly what prompted the tirade, but I think he was trying to make us afraid of engaging in any type of sexual activity, even ones that can't result in pregnancy, and I think he was also trying to paint sex between gay men as inherently dangerous. Another time he used a class period to talk about what he called the sin of masturbation. I remember him telling all the girls in the class to look around the room, and then he said, "Every boy in here masturbates, and if they say otherwise, they're lying." If my old Bible teacher happens to be watching this video, girls masturbate too, my guy. Again, I can't remember exactly why he brought this up in class, but I think he was trying to illustrate how difficult he thought it was for men to overcome sexual sin. He wanted us to feel like it was a real and present danger. I remember looking around the room at all the boys. They were all just kind of hanging their heads in shame. And I too felt ashamed because I had sexual urges, but as he had implied, that was only a guy thing. I thought that meant that something was wrong with me. He'd also constantly warn us about homosexuality. In my senior year, he had the whole class write a paper about whether or not we should legalize gay marriage in the US. At the time, gay marriage wasn't federally legal. I knew he wanted us to present an argument for why it shouldn't be legalized, but I just couldn't do it. I wonder why. I wrote that I believed it was sinful because I felt like I'd be shunned from the community if I didn't, but that it should be legalized because we can't legislate based on religious beliefs. Even then, I recognized to a certain extent that the only arguments against homosexuality were religious ones, and that legislating based on religious beliefs was the practice of a theocracy. I believe there was only one other student in the class that advocated for it to be legalized, and I'm pretty sure that he gave us both a bad grade on that paper. He even used class time to degrade alumni. He'd occasionally bring up a previous student that had graduated, gone back to the US, and came out as a lesbian. He wouldn't say their name, but we all knew who he was talking about. He made an example out of them, saying that we need to be careful and protect ourselves from worldly influences. He said if we don't, then we too could fall into the trap of homosexuality. When I graduated and moved back to the US, I made sure that I wasn't connected to my Bible teacher on any social media platforms because I was afraid of doing something he disapproved of and being used as an example in future classes, which I probably still was. Gossip travels fast in mission communities. Oh God, I need a drink after talking about my Bible teacher. As I reflect back, I realize that the amount of control my Bible teacher wanted over the intimate parts of his students' lives was incredibly inappropriate. Even though at the time I did have a problem with his behavior, I don't think I recognized it for what it was. I believe that being held to strict moral standards was just part of Christianity, and that those who enforced those standards were just trying to be good Christians. I've since realized that his attempts to control the lives of his students stemmed from what he perceived as his own moral failings. He wanted to make sure we didn't fail where he felt he had. I think he believed that if he could control the lives of his students, that he'd somehow be able to absolve himself. In reality, all he and others like him did was traumatize those around them and cause many MKs to grow up with a greatly distorted view of sexuality. My Bible teacher wasn't the only one in the community who did things like this. There were certain missionaries who designated themselves as the morality police. They'd make sure that everything from the clothes we wore to the things we said met their standards of holiness. If you've ever read or watched The Handmaid's Tale, they walked around the mission community somewhat like the eyes of Gilead, monitoring and reporting back on any transgressions they saw. It felt like I was constantly being watched and scrutinized. Not only was I expected to keep myself sexually pure, but I was to be the perfect godly role model to the locals and to my peers in every situation. We were supposed to be symbols of Christ to everyone around us. It even seemed like certain personalities were more desirable or more Christ-like than others. Every year, my entire school, students and teachers, as well as other members of the mission community, would go on this 2-week trip to an interior village in Papua. We called these trips outdoor education, or OE, and they worked somewhat like short-term missions. We'd do everything from service projects like painting houses, to distributing medical supplies, to hosting vacation Bible school for the local children. OE was mandatory for all students, and it was actually something we were graded on. Participation was a huge part of our grade, which makes sense to a certain extent. The teachers wanted students to take an active role in OE activities. The problem was some of the teachers had a very specific idea of what participation looked like, and some students, especially the introverted ones like myself, didn't really fit this mold. As I've talked about many times on my channel, I am a proud introvert. I need my alone time to recharge, so OE was always difficult for me because it meant 2 weeks of constant socializing. I was never able to meet their expectations when it came to participation. One of the ways I tried to participate was to help with worship during our devotionals, but for the teachers, adequate participation meant approaching the locals and trying to talk to them about the gospel. I was never able to do that. I'm just not the type of person to approach strangers, let alone try and convince them of the validity of my religion. That always lowered my grade. Teachers told me that I wasn't trying at certain things and that I could have been a better light for Christ to the locals. It really felt like I was being punished for being introverted. I felt like, and I think I actually was, looked down on for just being myself, and that other personality types were more desirable or more godly. No matter what I did, I felt like I wasn't living up to the standards of those around me. My environment as a teenager was so incredibly rigid, and if I dared to step outside the lines, I was met with harsh criticism. Because of this childhood environment, I've developed into an adult with a very loud inner critic, and I think this is common for many adult MKs. I wasn't empowered by the community I was in to make decisions for myself or given the space to learn and grow from mistakes. Mistakes weren't just things to learn from, they were life-destroying sins. So now as an adult, I still don't feel qualified to make decisions about my own life. As a child, everything was black and white. My actions were met with swift judgments from those around me, and I was used to being told that I was either being good or being bad. Reality is a lot more gray, and people aren't meant to be put into good or bad boxes. I think many adult MKs struggle with their own identity and distinguishing between living life how they want to versus living life how they think they're supposed to. I know I do. For so long, our identity was so tightly intertwined with the mission and being good Christians that now as adults, we struggle to know who we are outside of that. Calling back to the intro of this video, I think that's why the brothers interviewed by Ken Ham could only describe their experience as missionary kids in terms of their parents' mission. I'm constantly having to ask myself if I'm doing something because it's genuinely what I want to do, or if it's because I think that's what I'm supposed to do. I've lived so much of my life trying to meet the arbitrary standards of others that sometimes I don't even know what my own motivations are. It's something that I'm getting better at, but to be honest, I have a long road ahead of me. As I got closer to graduating, the adult missionaries began warning me about what I would face when I moved back to the US for college. They said that I would be tempted by worldly things and exposed to non-Christians who'd try to lead me away from the faith. I was taught apologetics so that hopefully I'd be able to defend my faith from those who'd try to undermine it. They weren't entirely wrong to issue me a warning. I, along with my fellow MKs, had grown up in this very insular environment where everyone believed the same thing. We were sheltered from ideas that might cause us to question our core beliefs, and we honestly hadn't been exposed to the real world. Many of us were scared to graduate and face this terrifying world because we were taught to be afraid of anything that wasn't Christianity, and more specifically, anything that wasn't the mission community. At the time, I reassured myself that even if terrible things happened to me as an adult, I would still always have my relationship with Christ. My faith was the one thing I thought I'd never lose. Turns out I was wrong about keeping my faith, but living in the secular world isn't nearly as terrible as the mission community made it out to be. Don't get me wrong, undergoing such a huge ideological change was scary, but for me, things got better from there. Every day, I grow a little more distant from the fear I was instilled with. This has been one of the hardest videos I've ever made. It's been more emotionally taxing than I ever could have predicted, and the script has literally taken me weeks upon weeks to write. It's been worth it for me though, because I think it's important that a real story of what it's like to grow up as a missionary kid is finally told, rather than one which is only meant to paint missionary work in the best possible light. I also want to make sure to mention that even though in this video I've shared a lot of the hardships and trauma I experienced as an MK, growing up the way I did isn't something I'd change. It's made me the person I am today, and there are some great things I took away from that experience. Some of my closest friends are people I met in the mission community. In this video though, I really wanted to shed light on some of the darker aspects of MK life because those are the things that are rarely talked about. I have so many more stories to tell from my life as an MK, but the ones I included in this video were the ones that I thought I really needed to talk about. If you guys are interested in hearing more MK stories, drop me a comment down below. I hope this video reaches some MKs out there that have experienced similar things to me. What we've gone through growing up in high control environments is hard and isn't something that's widely talked about. Hopefully, I've achieved my goals of making us a bit more visible and letting others know that they're not alone. Thanks so much for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you want to follow me on social media, my Instagram is Taylor_the_antibot, and my Twitter is the antibot. If you'd like to donate to this channel financially, a link to my Patreon will be down in the description, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Say bye!